Welcome everyone, welcome back to Lowlands Wargaming. Today we're going in an in-depth video again, just like our Eastlings video the other day, but this time we're talking about Minas Tirith. Minas Tirith is one of the largest armies in Middle-earth SBG, one of the largest factions with the most amount of heroes. So there's a lot of options and a lot of things to talk about. So strap yourselves in, grab something nice to drink or to eat, because this is going to be another long one. I'll be taking you through everything. Now, before we begin, of course, another disclaimer. All of this is my opinion as a player. I've played quite a bit with Minas Tirith. I have a fairly solid track record with them, so I do like to think I know what I'm talking about. But I am just human, I am not perfect, so if you disagree with me or anything that I'm saying, just let me know in the comments and we'll have a discussion in there. I'm always open to people's feedback and questions, and I love to discuss it with other people. So today we're going to be talking about, of course, the units of Minas Tirith, the heroes, the warriors, all the options that you have. I'm going to be talking about some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses of the list. We'll also discuss like how to play them, or maybe some tips and tricks that I have for them. And also, as just like last time, we'll close off with what you should do if you're playing against Minas Tirith and some tips and tricks there. Now, I'm considering all of this from a competitive standpoint, so there's also lots of space for a very thematic list with Minas Tirith, but not necessarily the most optimal choices, but I'll also go over those when we reach those units or those heroes that are, in my opinion, suboptimal. First things first, let's talk about the army bonus. When you take Minas Tirith, all of the units in your army, heroes and warriors with the Gondor keyword, get a +1 bonus to their courage. It's not a bad bonus, but it's not that great either, especially considering you have access to some bodyguard troops in your army list. It is quite nice that it also affects heroes other than Gandalf, but he has such high courage that he doesn't really need it. It makes him a little bit more reliable in charging terror units without having to spend their will points in order to pass the courage test. So it is quite nice, but it's not essential. So if you want to take yellow allies, don't worry about losing the army bonus. It's not that critical. Now, let's talk about the heroes. Minas Tirith has 3 big centerpiece heroes in the list. These are King Ellesar or Aragorn, Boromir, Captain of the White Tower, and Gandalf the White. All 3 of these are incredibly expensive heroes, costing more than 200 points a pop, so it's very unlikely that you will run more than one of them in your army list. So frequently when you start building a Minas Tirith army, your first question is like, which of the 3 do I take? Or do I take any of them at all? So let's start with those. First and foremost, who other to begin with than Aragorn the King? He is King Ellesar. He is the biggest, baddest, beefiest good hero that is around, because he is the king. He's quite powerful. He has a 6-inch banner effect. He wounds everything on 4+ thanks to his very special sword. He's of course got his mighty hero, letting him use a free might point every turn. On an armored horse, he's got everything that you could want in a hero. Good fight value, good attacks, wounds, you name it, he's pretty much got it. It does come at a pretty hefty points cost, so you do pay for all of these things. But you know, what's not to love? He just gives you a whole bunch of options, and also he's a hero of legend, so he gives you plenty of warband spaces, so you can cram in a lot of warriors in there, and maybe, you know, take one fewer other heroes so you can make up the numbers that you lose by bringing him along. Of course, unfortunately, his banner effect is a banner effect and not actually a banner for victory points. So if you truly want to play this competitively, you should probably still take a banner in the list, and then you pay even more points for, you know, this redundancy of having a banner for victory points. Nonetheless, Ellesar is a really solid hero, a really good pick if you know what you're doing with him, and just having that, you know, reliability of the might every turn for free. Even in a very, very late game, you're just guaranteed to always be able to call a heroic move, and in the early game you can call a heroic march for free, because, you know, it's a free might point anyways, you're not fighting yet. So overall, Ellesar is a really, really solid pick. But, and here's the but, you don't see him often. And why is that? That's because there's a better option, and that's Boromir, Captain of the White Tower. Why is Boromir better? Well, he is just like Ellesar, a really solid hero. Fight 6, 3 attacks, 3 wounds, you know, high defense, high courage, all the things that you could want. But he's got 6 might points, and even better, he's got a banner option that's also 6 inches, but it gives +1 fight bonus to warriors nearby. And it makes him fight 7 and it doesn't give him any penalties for having the banner. So suddenly Boromir is not just a really solid combat hero, he also buffs the rest of your army and gives that much needed reliability to always outfight your opponent, unless they are elves. So would you ever take Ellesar? Of course, if you don't feel like playing Boromir. But in my opinion, on average, Boromir is going to do more for your army and is a better, point sink than Ellesar is, because let's face it, both of them are incredibly expensive and you're never going to take both. So Boromir with the banner also means a lot for your list building and your army building, but I'll cover that later. Don't forget that Boromir also has the Horn of Gondor, which means that opponents, if they outnumber you, have to take a courage test, and if they fail, you automatically win the fight. It's very useful if you charge a bunch of orcs or something. But frequently you don't really need a Horn of Gondor because you can win it purely on fight value and attacks anyway. So I think I've had it once where the Horn of Gondor was actually useful, and it's more like a fun thing than actually that critical. The one thing that Boromir does struggle with, if you take the banner instead of a lance, is killing. He has strength 4 and he has got 3 attacks, 4 in a charge with knockdown, so if he charges infantry it's probably dead. But he can really struggle against defense 7 troops or heroes, because you'll need 6s to wound. So don't go calling a bunch of hero combats with Boromir if he's up against a bunch of those kind of troops, because he's probably not going to kill all of them and you'll waste your might, or you have to spend might in order to win and keep moving. One thing that Boromir really excels at is bullying other heroes. Sure, they might even have higher fight value than him, they might be scarier than him, but he's got 6 might points, so he can strike 6 turns in a row. And your opponent will run out of might, and eventually you will win that combat and they will die, maybe. It depends on if you can kill them. The problem with that is that if you do botch a combat, Boromir might be fine with his defense 7, 3 wounds and 3 fate, but his horse is probably gone, and when his horse is gone he's a lot less powerful. So still, you have to be a little bit careful with Boromir, you can't just do everything. But he's a really powerful hero to have to buff your army, but also just throw into combats, throw into enemy heroes. He can handle any of it, just like Aragorn could, but Aragorn doesn't do as much for the rest of your army as Boromir does. But there is a third really expensive hero, and he's not on the table. And that's for a good reason, because in my opinion he sucks. I'm talking about Gandalf the White. Now there's a lot to be discussed about Gandalf. He's an iconic character, he is incredibly powerful because he has really good magic spells, he gets a bunch of free will every turn to cast them with, he's got a really special horse, he can actually fight pretty well with strike, good fight value, strength 5 when he's making strikes because of Glamdring, he's got a whole bunch of nifty little things. But you're paying 240 points for him on a horse, what the hell? I mean, he doesn't even fight that well, he's got the combat stats of like Irolas, minus, the cavalry aspect of it, but like, the problem with Gandalf is that you're paying the big bucks because he's and a spellcaster and a combat hero mashed into one, and you're paying full price for both of those aspects. You're not getting a discount. And that's the problem. If he's fighting, he's probably not doing magic, and if he's doing behind your lines doing magic, you're not getting the value out of him that he would get out of combat. And for his points, he really can't really hold up to other combat heroes that are even like half or 3/4 of his cost. So if there's an enemy big bad around, then you have to be really careful with Gandalf, or he's just going to get eaten, and then you can just cast spells, and frankly he's just not worth 240 points to just cast spells, and he's also not worth 240 points to charge in and do some killing, because Hurin, who has pretty much the same killing power if not better, does it for 80 points, I think, 90? I don't know, a lot less. So I never take Gandalf, I rarely see other people take Gandalf, and that's for a very good reason. Magic is powerful, but not at that cost. So that covers the big 3 top dogs. Obviously I have a clear preference. I think Boromir and Aragorn are both solid picks, but Boromir for me is just always a little bit better because it just does more for your army and also for your VPs. This makes him the better pick in my opinion. Also, he combines quite well with Denethor. Which brings us to Denethor. Denethor is probably like the 4th hero people think about when they think about Minas Tirith. The steward of Gondor, the cowardly dude that sets himself on fire. He is a measly 35 points for a hero of valor. Incredibly, incredibly cheap. It's probably like the cheapest way, other than, I don't know, Lake Town or some stuff like that, Goblin Town, to bring a bunch of bodies onto the table. It comes with a downside. He has to take courage tests every turn if Boromir is not on the field, otherwise he might turn evil for a turn. But his courage is so high and he has so much will that you don't really care about it. The biggest downside of taking him is that he doesn't have might. He's a hero without might. He doesn't even have fate. He has some will points and that's about it. He does have 2 wounds, he's 5/5, he's got 2 attacks, he's no slouch in combat. So why would you take Denethor? Well, Denethor is really interesting because it lets you take a different playstyle. It lets you create a situation on purpose where your leader is really, really weak and doesn't contribute anything to the army. So that you can hide him behind a terrain piece and just leave him there for the rest of the game and deny your opponents even the opportunity to take leader victory points. Every scenario in the game other than Fog of War has leader VPs in it. Of course, with Contest of Champions, you can't exactly hide Denethor behind a terrain piece. But all the other scenarios, yeah, sure, you just hide him. You don't need him. Even better, if he's hiding behind a terrain piece, he can't be killed, and if he's not dead, then Bodyguard is up. So all of your Bodyguard units, like the Fountain Court card, will always stick around, because they automatically pass all of their courage tests. So that's how I play Denethor. I just hide him, I don't use him. Now if my opponent doesn't have any special tricks or lots of shooting or magic or whatever, sometimes I actually bring Denethor forward. He can just take on enemy warriors, you know, you just hide him in your shield wall and you just, you know, send him into some warriors. He's still strength 4, 2 attacks, 5/5, he's no slouch in combat. You just need to make sure that the enemy doesn't have an opportunity to send a big hero into him and kill him, because then, you know, you lose your leader, which is bad. Another reason to send Denethor forward is if you have Hurin in your list. Hurin is an excellent hero, Hero of Valor, one of the recent additions to the list, Forge World model. He's got a Master Forge 2-handed weapon, which means he always gets a +1 to wound because he doesn't take the penalty. And he's got this special rule where if your leader is a Gondor hero, as a keyword, so it could also be Imrahil or Fellowship Boromir, any hero with the Gondor keyword, not Gandalf the White, he's not from Gondor, apparently. Then if your leader dies, you don't lose victory points. You just take the victory points for having leader wounded, not killing them, which is quite beneficial. But mostly he's just a hero with strike on a horse, 5/5 already, and with a 2-handed sword for a really good price. So for me, it's one of those heroes that I always try to take in a Minas Tirith list if I have space for him, especially if I can make sure that another Minas Tirith hero is my leader, because then his special rule kicks in. His other special rule is that if he's within, I think, 3 or 6 inches of Denethor or King Ellesar, then he becomes fearless and he gets an extra reroll in his duel on top of any banner rerolls, which makes him even more reliable in combat, which is another reason to bring Denethor forward. So that he can, you know, have that little benefit, and he's just helping, you know, Hurin out with some killing. I think out of those heroes, Denethor, Boromir, and Hurin at high points levels are pretty much my staples. I really like bringing Denethor so that he can be my leader and I can keep him safe and deny my opponent those victory points. And then Boromir is just free to do his thing. I don't have to worry about him taking a wound. I don't even have to worry about him dying as much, as long as it accomplishes what I need him to, because I'm not giving anything away. Making Boromir your leader is still a fine choice. He's very hard to kill. He's kind of like the Emperor in a way, where, you know, your opponent can try to kill him, but at what cost? You might actually end up winning the game because they're trying to go for your leader and for those victory points. But I just prefer having Denethor hiding behind a rock somewhere. It's just a much safer bet. Moving on to, I think, the almost final Valor hero. We have Boromir's brother, Faramir, the second son, the shitty son, the disappointment of Denethor. I think it's quite fitting, considering how much of a disappointment he was to his dad, that Faramir is actually a pretty shit profile. Just like Gandalf, he's not bad. You know, you'll never complain about having a Faramir on the field. You'll just complain about how much you paid for him. If you compare him to Hurin, you pay about 20 points more, I think, for him than, you know, Hurin on a horse, you know, fully kitted. The only advantage he has is that he's got an armored horse, because he has a lance, but the lance is just objectively worse than a 2-handed sword, right? He's got, okay, sure, he's got one more defense, but who cares? he's so much more expensive, and he's just worse. He doesn't do anything for your army. He has no special rules that are beneficial. He's just a really expensive captain, and that doesn't improve his quality, unfortunately. But what if you run him as a ranger? Well, just take Madril instead. He does the same job for infinitely cheaper. Or what if you just take him in heavy armor and put him in a shield wall? It could be a nice anchor for your force while Boromir leads the cavalry, right? Well, I would never lead the cavalry of Boromir. I would put him in the center of the shield wall, even if he's on a horse. But that point aside, if you want someone to lead your shield wall, you should take Ingold instead. He is so much better at it than Faramir is. So for me, there's never a reason to take Faramir, because there's always someone in the list that will do it better. So sorry if you just bought the shiny new box that has the nice plastic Faramir hero in it, or for that matter, sorry if you bought the battle host that has Gandalf in it. In my opinion, those two profiles just aren't worth it for competitive play. Now, the final Valar hero is a King of Men. The King of Men is an unnamed hero that you can use to represent a king or a steward from a different age. There's no reason to play a King of Men unless you are playing Earl the Young, which is a special list I'll talk a little bit about later on. Along the same vein, you have a Knight of the White Tower, while we're talking about these profiles anyway. Also an unnamed hero. He has Strike, interesting two-handed sword. I personally wouldn't really take him in a Minas Tirith list. If you want someone to be a striker like that, you just take Hurin instead. But again, it's a profile that's very interesting if you're playing Earl the Young and you want to ally in Minas Tirith. So that's a point there. Let's stay with unnamed heroes. Of course, there is the captain. Don't take the captain. Minas Tirith is one of those lists where there's so many hero options that there's never really a reason to bring a generic captain. I think the only reason you could ever bring a generic captain is maybe if you're playing the Ranger Legendary Legion and you run out of points or something and you need another hero, but that would be really wild. If you want a striker on a horse, you take Hurin. If you want an infantry hero, you take Ingold. Just don't bother with a captain. If you need March, you take Madril. Anything he can do, others can do better. Speaking of Ingold, let's talk about Ingold. I've already mentioned him a few times. He's, along with Hurin, another Forge World addition. Incredibly solid hero. Defense 7, he's got shield wall, so he can go up to defense 8. He has strike. He's got a really nifty special rule that everyone within 3 inches doesn't have to back away in a fight. If you ever want to run like a warband of pure Minas Tirith warriors with like no rangers or Fountain Court guards in the back line, he is your guy. He will make sure that shield wall will stay up, because your regular warriors, they have shield wall, but we all know that shield wall is really hard to keep up. Maybe in the first round of combat you'll have it, but in the second round of combat it's gone. So it's only really useful against shooting, pesky crossbows and things like that. But if you have Ingold, then you can actually keep shield wall up because you don't have to back away. You never have to back away, so you can stay in this really nice formation, and then your opponent charges you, or you charge your opponent, and everyone's in base contact, and you never have to back away. So it'll be glorious. Can be really useful if your opponent is running a bunch of strength 4 guys. That being said, there are so many good heroes in Minas Tirith list, and they're quite expensive that I often find myself out of space to take him. You take Boromir, you take Denethor, you take Hurin. And then usually my pick after that would be Madril or maybe Ingold. But you're already kind of tight for points. You also want to take some siege. You maybe want to take one of those minor heroes that we haven't discussed yet to fill out your warband slots. So you're really tight for points. So Ingold also has a place in lists at lower points values. When you're not taking your big honchos, like 400, maybe 500 points, you could foresee, you could take a fortitude list. And he would do quite well in that. Alongside him, a Forge World release is Irolas. He's not on the table. I don't own Irolas, unfortunately. He's like one of the few profiles that I don't have. He's quite decent. He doesn't really do anything for your army per se. He's got a few special things. He's got this rule where if he shields, he can still make a single strike. He's got fight 5. He's got strike, if I remember correctly. So he's not bad. Quite interesting, if he's your army leader, he bodyguards himself, so he effectively becomes fearless. So if you ever want to take like just fortitude heroes, he could actually be a pretty decent army leader. He'll just never run away because he can't. And then him and Ingold would make a pretty good you know, pair and maybe chuck Madril in there or something, and you'll be all right. So he's definitely a solid hero, but he's not someone I look at and like, oh yeah, this dude really helps the rest of my army. He's good. He's not bad. He's all right. But who's better? Well, Madril's better. Madril is the ranger hero that I would recommend everyone to get if they play Minas Tirith, and to run. Not to lead a ranger warband, just to lead yet another Minas Tirith warband. But he does two really important things for your army. Well, three. One, he has got 30 points of might, which is really useful. Two, he's got march, so you can make your army more mobile and, you know, get to the objectives that you need to get to faster. And then the last one is he's got this ambush rule where if you're running Maelstrom or Reconnoiter, his warband gets +1 or -1 on the rolls if you want. And then once he's on the field, all of your warbands get this bonus. So over Maelstrom, you will have a lot of control over where your warbands go, and especially if you're bringing siege, that can be very critical. So he's a very, very solid pick. A few other armies have heroes that do something like it, and you see that they're just really, really good to have if you're playing Maelstrom. Now, next to Madril, there's of course some other ranger heroes. These are all minor heroes. They are all kind of similar in that they're pretty efficient for their points. They're really cheap. They have really, you know, mediocre stats, but that's what you're paying for. And they have some special rules that make them better at shooting, or, you know, make the rangers that are near them better, or things along those lines. So you typically see them run either only in the Legendary Legion of the Rangers, which we'll cover later, or to lead a Ranger warband, like a little micro warband. Personally, I'm not a fan of this. I like my Rangers with spears and in the back line of my other warband, so I can make my shield walls larger while still having the shooting. So if I want a micro warband of, you know, some more flexible units that I want to deploy, I usually take the last minor hero in the list, and that is Beregrond. So Beregrond only has a foot model, but he actually has a horse option, so there is some third parties model flowing around where he can make conversion, which lets him ride around on a horse. And having a bodyguard hero with a longbow on a horse is really useful. That's like the quintessential objective contester, right? He's never going to run away as long as your leader's alive. He's got some might to call on move or something along those lines, or combat. He's got a longbow, so he can still be useful from a distance. So that's really nice, and he's not too expensive in doing it. So you could run him maybe with some other Citadel guards on horse, and have a really useful warband to, you know, harass, skirmish, and maybe capture some objectives. Oh, and before I forget, there's actually one more hero of Fortitude that I glossed over because I never take him and I never see him on the field, and that's Cirion. He's one of those heroes where there's a really interesting niche special rule that he's got like extra bonus to charge terror things and, you know, against Blade of the Dead. But he's not really worth taking over any of the other profiles. So the only reason I would ever recommend anyone bringing him is if you know for a fact that your opponent is playing the Army of the Dead. Then you could cheese and take him, because then he's actually really fucking good. But other than that, just leave him home, take Ingold instead, or another infantry hero, and they're just better. Lastly, in terms of heroes, there's of course the Siege. They're also heroes because they have Siege veterans. So Siege is interesting. Some people hate Siege, some people love Siege. I think Siege is good to have in the Minas Tirith list, and that's because other than Gandalf, there's nothing in your list that really forces your opponent to do something different, other than maybe some shooting or whatever. Siege will force your opponent into awkward positions or to come towards you or things like that. It gives you a little bit of interaction that you need, that you don't really have otherwise with this army, which is unfortunate. The problem with Siege is that you're a good player. Like, you play Forces of Good. I'm not saying that all of you are really high competitive. No, okay. Siege, as a good player, it's awkward because you're not allowed to shoot your own guys. So you could have this tastiest shot in the world, but there's just one warrior in the blast radius and you're just not allowed to take the shot. It sucks. That's unfortunate. Bolt throwers obviously don't have this issue because they're direct fire, but bolt throwers can still be blocked by your own guys, so you'll need to make sure you position it properly. Do I take Siege? The answer is sometimes. Especially at higher points level, I think you need to take Siege as Minas Tirith, because that's when the big toys start coming more and more, and you'll have more and more proper targets for siege to shoot at. And you'll need something to make your opponent's life difficult, because the rest of your army, while being solid, while being decent in the hands of the right player, can definitely achieve every objective the game can throw at you. It also is never unfair. Siege is the thing that is unfair. Siege is the thing like a compel from a ring rift that can really mess with your opponent's plans. If your opponent has this perfect, bottleneck that they can sit in and could win them the game because their troops are just better than yours, I'm looking at you, Eastlings. The trebuchet shot could really mess up their day. If they have really high defense troops that don't care about your shooting, a bolt thrower could still force them to come forward, because the bolt thrower will still throw strength 7 hits towards them. So the siege, trebuchet 80 points, bolt thrower 70 points, because you always take the upgrade on the bolt thrower. It's just like a hero that can buy a horse. It's just, that's the points that they cost, because you always buy the horse. They're good options. You really have to know what you're doing with positioning to use a bolt thrower effectively. And the problem is with the bolt thrower, there's quite a few scenarios where it is a bit of a dud. Your army has to deploy forward, because otherwise your opponent is going to be sitting on the objective, and then your army is in front of your bolt thrower, and your bolt thrower will never be able to shoot something, so it'll just have to skirt to the side, or maybe it'll just move up and only do a single heroic move with the veterans might point at the end of the game, or something like that. Similarly, in some situations the trebuchet will just do nothing. Either it will miss all of its shots because it just hits on a 4+, or it'll run out of shots because all the lines are engaged and you're a good guy, you're not allowed to shoot anymore, so it'll just plunk a rock at some archers that are lagging behind or something and not really accomplish anything. But then there are situations where trebuchet will literally win you the game. If you have a really scary enemy hero that's on a fell beast or on a boar or something, and the first round the trebuchet already knocks them off their horse or fell beast, and they need to pass a fate, otherwise they're just dead. That's really powerful. Similarly, if your opponent is an idiot and keeps a nice formation, and you plunk a rock in the middle of it and everything dies, that could just literally win you the game. But then your opponent's also really bit dumb if they let you do that and shoot a rock in the middle of a shield wall formation. That's the thing that a trebuchet does. It forces your opponent to hide, to spread out, to be awkward, and that's, if you're a good player, you can get an advantage. You can, force them in these awkward positions to spread out and to get better engagements, to maybe get some traps off that you otherwise wouldn't, or, just apply your force in such a way that you get an advantage. And even for one round, that could make a really big difference in the flow of the game. So Siege, as much as some people hate them, I think if you want to play Minas Tirith at higher points levels, you'll need to take at least one of the two. Now, if we have covered the heroes, let's talk about the warriors, and then I promise you we'll move on to the other topics that we have to discuss. Let's start with your bread and butter, the warriors of Minas Tirith. You'll notice I have some special sculpts on the table here that are not Games Workshop sculpts. I also have Games Workshop sculpts, but our local community, thankfully, is pretty relaxed about this kind of stuff, and will also let you take other things. Because personally, I think the 20-year-old sculpts are a little bit dated, but they still get the job done. If I go to official tournaments, I take the regular guys. If I go to a more casual environment, I'll take the third-party sculpts. So the warriors of Minas Tirith, they're solid. That's just it. They have shield wall, they have fight 3, defense 6. They're just your run-of-the-mill humans. Shield wall, like I mentioned earlier, don't expect too much out of it. Once the line's clash, you have to back away. It's really hard to always, stay touching with 2 of your guys. They're good, but they're not amazing. And the problem is that if you want to make them amazing, you can bring something like Boromir, and then they become fight 4, and are becoming a bit better. But if you truly want to, shine, you want to get to fight 5, and that's where the other profiles come into play. Most notably, the Rangers of Gondor, the Rangers of Ithilien, are, in my opinion, some of the most underrated profiles in the game. They're incredibly good. A Ranger with a spear is just as expensive as a Warrior of Minas Tirith with a spear and a shield. But they have fight 4 and they have really good shooting. On a 3+, strength 2 hit, there's nothing, it's really not shabby. Just shoot at horses and dismount a bunch of them, or maybe plink away at the opponent's numbers. It's just enough shooting to force your opponent to come to you. In most cases, as a Minas Tirith army, if you're taking a third of your force as Rangers with spear, which in my opinion you always should, you'll outshoot your opponent and you can dictate the flow of the battlefield. You can decide where you're going to fight, and you can make your opponent come towards you, and that's how you could win that game depending on what scenario it is. So Rangers, incredibly powerful. Near Boromir, they become 5/5. He is waving the banner around, and as we all know, 5/5 is pretty good to have, especially with banner rerolls. You'll be winning most of your fights, unless you're fighting elves or Easterlings with the Emperor nearby. The other source of 5/5 or 5/4 are the Fountain Court Guards. Again, some special sculpts here. Fountain Courts are my favorite warrior profile from Minas Tirith. They're so good. Yes, they're a little bit more expensive, but you're getting higher fight, you're getting higher defense, you're getting bodyguard. So anything scary, you don't care, you'll be able to charge it. Holding objective, you don't care, you'll stay there even if you're broken, because Denethor is hiding behind a rock somewhere or standing in a house. These guys are just fantastic. They're almost impossible to kill. With defense 7, even strength 4 units will have a tough time killing them. They can shield. I've started running more and more of them. You could literally spam these guys and do well with them, even if you're not running any shooting. I would still take shooting, but you get my point. They're just incredibly solid profile. You can't go wrong with Fountain Court Guard. The only annoying thing about them is that they're only available in Finecast at the moment, and Finecast is kind of horrible. So you might want to try and, scout down some old metal sculpts in your local marketplace if you can, or you'll have to suck it up and buy the Finecast versions. Last and not least are the Citadel Guards. You'll see a few of them here with bows and on horses, because Citadel Guard can take horses. They standard come with spears. They're not a bad source of 5/5 or 5/4 in your back line, but in my opinion, Fountain Court Guard do it better. They also have the bodyguard, but they actually have, proper high defense, which something which the Citadel Guard lacks. Where they shine is when they're mounted and they have a longbow. The longbow is nice, but with a shoot value of 4+, don't expect it to do too much. But mounted, they become the ultimate objective grabbers. I already mentioned this as Beregrond, and Beregrond is basically Citadel Guard on steroids. They have bodyguard, so they'll stick around it because Denethor is alive. They have a horse, so they can go there fast, and they have a bow, so they can still contribute to the fight, even if they're sitting on an objective somewhere at the side of the board. So I always try to take 1 or 2 of these guys in my list, and they're my default objective grabbers, and if there's no objectives to grab that game, they can still go to a flank, keep the opponent in check, maybe plink off a few shots to threaten a hero on a horse, something like that, and generally just be a nuisance, which is also really nice to have and bother your opponent with. Now last and certainly not least are the Knights of Minas Tirith. The Knights are good. They're shock cavalry, they're not too expensive, 14 points for a dude on a horse with a lance and heavy armor. They're quite survivable. Usually when they lose a fight, the horse is more likely to die than they are, especially against strength 3 opponents. So they'll stick around on foot and still do something. The problem with them is that they have trouble winning fights. If they win, they'll kill, especially against infantry because they're using a lance. But at 5/3, if they're near Boromir, they'll go up to 5/4, and on the charge you'll have a reroll. You have like 3 dice to win. Suddenly they're quite good. So near Boromir they're actually quite alright. But as like a hammer and anvil thing, where they'll like be out of range of Boromir, it just doesn't work in my opinion, because your opponent will either be 5/4 and just win the fights on ties and have more dice or equal amounts of dice because they have some spear supports lying around. Or they're 5/3, but they're like horde-ish, and you could try and charge into them, but then they have the weight of dice to just win the fight still and instantly kill you. You might like win 1 or 2 fights and kill a dude or 2, but then you lose your cavalry. So as a shock troop, they're decent, but they're just not quite reliable enough to win their fights, in my opinion. So I typically find myself including some of them, but not a lot of them. I'm usually 2, maybe 4 in an army, to run around with Boromir or Hurin and charge somewhere and do some damage, but I won't rely on them. They're good to have as a threat and to utilize if you need them. They can also grab objectives, they still are mobile, but I wouldn't overly invest into them. Okay, so that's it for the troops. Let's talk about some Legendary Legions before we dive into the tips and tricks. Minas Tirith has like 1.5 Legendary Legion. The first one, well, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. Let's start with the bad and the ugly. That is the Man of the West. It's not really a Minas Tirith Legendary Legion because it also has Rohan and fiefdoms in it. And it's not really worth mentioning because it's just literally worse than taking the same thing as a green alliance, because then your heroes can actually have horses. It's really thematic, I get it, it's cool, it's a cool moment in the movies, but it's just not that good. I have seen people do well with them, but that says more about the quality of that player and their dice than it does, about the quality of the Legendary Legion. If you truly care about competitive play, don't take Men of the West, unless you want to show off just how good you are or how lucky you are. It's just not that good of an option to take, and just, steer clear of it. Then for the good, and the other Legendary Legion, the Rangers of Ithilien was the first Legendary Legion, I think, that would let you take 100% bows. Incredibly powerful, breaking the fundamental rule of the game. Deservedly nerfed in the FAQ last year, forcing you to always take Frodo, Sam and Gollum. It's still not a bad Legion. Frodo, Sam and Gollum aren't bad. Like, Frodo is a ring bearer that helps opponents fight. Sam gets free heroic combats to help Frodo. You combine that with Faramir and suddenly you get quite useful things going on. And Gollum is, Gollum is Gollum. Having a bunch of rangers and, a single warrior of Minas Tirith waving a banner around, I think you can take him. And Faramir on a horse, some conversion needed. Is still quite powerful. Lots of shooting, enough to make your opponent really regret coming to the table that day. Often criticized as not a fun army to play against. I'll kind of agreed there, but at the same time, there's other armies that do the same thing these days. There's another Rangers list in the Elves. You have Assault on Helm's Deep now with ballistas and things like that. You have Assault on Lothlorien with goblins shooting in the night and things like that. So it's lost a little bit of its shine. It's not the only list out there anymore that can do something like this. And you'll also see it less after the nerf, but also because other lists like it rose to prominence and also give it unfavorable matchups. That being said, it's still a really powerful Legendary Legion, and if you love, taking ranges and having a bunch of shooting, it's a really solid thing to take, and you can still do well with it at tournaments, even at high points levels. It's really powerful because, Frodo with the ring and Faramir with strike, it gives you options to deal with big expensive things, and your rangers aren't bad profiles to have, and you can absolutely spam the ever-living shit out of them because they're not that expensive. Still a really solid option to have. So let's talk about how you play Minas Tirith and whether it's actually good. Minas Tirith is probably one of the most versatile armies in the game, in that it has something from every aspect of the game. It's got good heroes, it's got siege, it's got shooting, it's got a good shield wall, it's got cavalry. The only thing it's lacking is kind of like tricks or magic. So you're really relying on the base fundamentals of the game and your mastery of those fundamentals in order to win with Minas Tirith. And for this reason, it's a really solid army, but it also doesn't really shine in anything in particular. Which means that often you'll see veteran players go with other things that they'll enjoy using or abusing. They'll go to Angmar because they really love fucking with their opponent with magic. Or they really like, the solid shield wall aspect of things, and they might gravitate towards Iron Hills because, they're even more higher defense. So Minas Tirith is really the jack of all trades but master of none army that there is in the game. So would I recommend Minas Tirith to a player? Absolutely, especially if you're a beginning player and you're serious about learning the game and becoming better at it. Minas Tirith is a really, really solid army that will let you learn the results of playing properly and understanding in which situations you stay back, in which situations you move forward, how to set up your heroic combat slingshots, because that's all you have to work with. You have the base fundamentals of the game in your list, and those are the tools at your disposal. You don't have any funky special effects, or you're just a solid group of men that have to, work with what they got. So how do you do this? Well, if you're doing this properly, you have a bunch of shooting in your army. You're taking a third rangers with spears. This is my opinion, but I do think, and I'll stand by it, that you should take them, and you'll have a siege engine if you're playing at higher points. For most opponents, other than things like Assault on Helm's Deep, this is enough to make them come forward towards you. So this will already give you an advantage in that you can choose where, how and when to fight. Unless it's a scenario where you have to go forward, you know, like seize the prize or things like that, or, you know, command the battlefield. It'll give you an advantage, you know, that you can decide where to fight. Maybe you can set up your shield wall in such a way that your bolt thrower can still shoot into their spears once they engage, things like that. You'll learn all of these nitty-gritty little tricks that veteran players will know by playing with Minas Tirith, because those are the things that you need to utilize in order to win with this list. It's not like you can just win because I have Gulafar and you don't know how to play against flying monsters, so I'm just gonna, you know, fly into the side and hurl somebody down your line. Like, you can't do these things with Minas Tirith. You don't have those kind of options available to you. You just have assault, shield wall, assault, shooting, assault, heroes. So the strength of your army is that you can do everything other than the special tricks. Any scenario should be winnable. Any matchup you should have a shot at. You'll have unfavorable matchups, you'll have unfavorable scenarios because your opponent might be better at something, but typically you'll at least have a chance at everything. So a good player, admittedly, luck is also involved, will be able to win tournaments with Minas Tirith simply because they'll have an answer sort of to everything, or at very least they'll have a shot at everything. What you'll need to do when you come up to your opponent, you see their list and you know what the scenario is all right, how do I score victory points? How do I deny my opponent victory points? This is the same thing you should do with any army, by the way. But the difference is that your army will probably be better at most things than the opponent's army, except one or two. They'll be better at shooting, or they'll be better at just grinding, or they'll have better heroes, or they'll have magic where you don't have an answer to. So you need to identify those elements where your opponent has you beat, and be aware of how that could make you lose. And then you play accordingly. You mitigate those factors by being like, oh, you know, they have really strong magic. Maybe I should be more conservative with Boromir and you know, put him in spots where he can fight, but he can only fight, you know, enemy warriors, so that if he gets transfixed or something, then there's no enemy striker that can go into him and kill him. It'll just be warriors, and I don't have to worry about that. Things like that. So generally, how I do well with Minas Tirith is it revolves around two things. The first thing is Boromir and the banner and a solid shield wall around him. Before the Emperor came out, Boromir was the only one that could do something like that. You know, make a really cheap 5/5 warriors and give rerolls to them, and suddenly you have this really solid army that, you know, wins all of your shield wall to shield wall fights. Arguably the Emperor does it better now, so it's lost some of its shine, but it's still really good. And in most matchups that will still win most fights. You'll have some trouble killing if they're high defense, but you know, if you're pushing for an objective or something like that, it's still really powerful. The other aspect is that it's careful list building and using the elements in your list. I've already mentioned this during the units, but in case you skipped forward, I'll just, you know, rehash real quick. I'm a fan of third rangers with spear for shooting and 5/4, a bunch of Fountain Court Guard for bodyguard and defense 7, bringing Denethor so that he is your leader and you can hide him behind a rock and not give up victory points. For the same reason, bringing Hurin and some, you know, for some hitting power, and Boromir for, you know, running out the whole package. I'll also bring some siege to get some shooting, and that gives you a whole bunch of elements to play with. You know, you use your shield wall to outgrind your opponent, or if they're better at grinding, you just hang back, let your siege do the work, do the shooting, or maybe let your heroes do the work. You want to get into a spot where you always have options thanks to all the elements in your army, but you don't put yourself in a position where if you can't leverage those options, you'll automatically lose. Like, one of the mistakes I made as a player, I started with Minas Tirith again when I picked up the hobby again during COVID. I made a list with Boromir, Madril, a trebuchet and a bolt thrower, and a bunch of rangers. So I had a lot of shooting. But the problem was that if there was a scenario where I couldn't use my siege engines properly, I had so many points invested into them that my opponent was just outclassing me. Whereas if I would take one siege engine less and take, you know, a different hero along, I would have done a lot better in that tournament, I think. I still did decent, especially considering I didn't have that much experience, but you know, this is just one of those mistakes that you make. You need to make sure that you remain a jack of all trades, because that's the strength of the army. And if you don't have all of the tools in your toolbox when you're on the battlefield, you'll find yourself that you come into situations where you just have a hard time winning because you can't, you know, play in the way that you wanted to play. So, all that being said, Minas Tirith sees play in competitive events and competitive levels for a good reason, because you have all of these options to play with. But you'll see experienced players often move on to other armies if they enjoy other aspects of the games more. Okay, so let's round this up with how to play against Minas Tirith. So some of you might have skipped forward to this bit because you have no interest in playing Minas Tirith and you only want to know what to do when you're facing down Boromir or Ellesar and their men. Well, you've come to the right place. Minas Tirith is the jack of all trades, master of none. I've mentioned it before. So how do you play against an army that can literally do everything? It's difficult, it's tough. What you have to do, like always, first you look at what's the matchup like, what are the objectives, how can I score my victory points, and how is my opponent going to try to score them. Probably your army does at least one thing, hopefully two things, better than that Minas Tirith does it, because they're not really a master of anything, they're just going to do a little bit of everything. Maybe you'll outshoot Minas Tirith, maybe your shield wall is better, maybe your heroes are better, or you have better magic, you have something that's better than them. See how you can utilize that in order to get the victory points, to get the win, to put your opponent on the back foot. Maybe you're more mobile, so maybe you can play this cat and mouse game where you kind of pull their army apart, kind of like Eastlings with the Emperor. You don't want to let them fight in one place. If the Minas Tirith player has brought Boromir with his banner, you want to try and kind of pull him away or pull warriors away from him so that they're easier to defeat. If you have really strong shooting, like the Southern Helm's Deep, well, you know what to do. You just, pick the place where you want to fight and make them come towards you. And there's lots of ways of doing this. There's a few traps with Minas Tirith. They can do hammer and anvil really well. They can do refused flank really well. They can do all of these standard battlefield tactics because they have all of the standard troops that you need in order to pull those off. So be careful that you don't fall into those traps and find yourself in a spot where it becomes impossible to win the game. Now you will find that there are situations where the matchup is just really, really bad. Maybe Minas Tirith beats you on an aspect that is really important for that scenario. Maybe it sees the prize and you're an infantry army with no cavalry. And Minas Tirith obviously brings some cavalry and has march if they take Madril or Ellesar. So they'll be in the center first. Or it's taken hold, and the same thing applies. It's a Maelstrom scenario and they have Madril, so they have benefits there. You will run into situations where Minas Tirith is better than you on the key aspect for that specific scenario or situation, and it will become really hard to win. And it's up to you to figure out how to negate their advantage, how to work around that penalty, or at least minimize your exposure to those risks. I can't really give any specific tips and tricks because it's a general army. It does general things. It uses the game mechanics. So if you know how to beat somebody using the game mechanics, then you know how to beat Minas Tirith. If they're fighting in a shield wall, you have to use the tricks that are available to you to pull them apart. Use shooting the drum towards you, use heroes or magic as a can opener, surround them to get traps off, you name it. There's a bunch of tricks to deal with these things, and Minas Tirith is nothing special. It's not like there's a special thing to beat Minas Tirith that doesn't work in other armies, because Minas Tirith just isn't special by itself. One thing I will say is that be careful if they bring siege. Make sure you have scatter targets set up if they have a trebuchet. This really should speak for itself, but I've seen enough people just forget about it. Or I had this opponent that would set up everything perfectly and made sure there were scatter targets for all their heroes and stuff. And then they forgot that they had a crossbow warband just sitting somewhere ready to take a bunch of shots, and they were all standing base to base, and it was 8 of them or something. I was cool, you've done a good job. I'll just shoot at that instead. And I shot in the middle, I rolled a 6 on a scatter, and they all just died. And that's just a shame, because it's just such an easy mistake to prevent, and that's the difficulty of fighting against Minas Tirith. Because it has a little bit of everything in there, if you make a mistake, it'll probably have something that it can use to punish you. It just won't be as severe as an army that only focuses on that one thing would do it. But those other armies only have one thing that you really need to worry about usually. So, how to play against Minas Tirith? You just have to outplay your opponent. I know this sounds really stupid and straightforward, but that's because Minas Tirith is a really straightforward army. You will know what your opponent is going to do, because Minas Tirith is as clear as it comes. They will either stand still and shoot at you until you come towards them, or they'll move onto the objective with a shield and stand there, or they'll try hammer and anvil. Like, you can see it coming a mile away, so it's up to you to figure out what your opponent's plan is and to counter that plan with the strengths of your own army. And I can't give you any more specific tips than that, because it depends on what your army is and what the matchup and scenario is, what you'll have to do. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, I do really recommend playing with Minas Tirith to learn the game, but also playing against Minas Tirith to learn the game, because it really does utilize most of the aspects of the game quite well. So with all that being said, let's take a look at some list building advice. I won't go over specific lists, because I usually follow the same recipe when I'm building a Minas Tirith army. And it's something I've already, mentioned a few times during this video, but it's good to, take it from the top. If the points levels are high enough, I'm talking about probably 600 plus, you start by selecting a big hero. For reasons I mentioned in the hero discussion, I never take Gandalf, so it's a choice between Boromir or, Ellesar. Usually I'll end up taking Boromir, unless I'm feeling spicy and I want to take Ellesar for some reason. He's not a bad option, but usually Boromir is just, better. Once he's taken, depending on the points level, I'll take Denethor, Hurin, and Madril. Two of those three, probably. It kind of depends on the points level. I really like Denethor to be the hero, because you can hide him and keep him safe. Hurin is just incredibly efficient profile. I take him even as like an army leader on low points or something like that. He's just incredibly good. Madril gives you some more might and access to march, which can be very useful to have, especially if you're not bringing Ellesar. Now, to round out the force, you need a bunch of warriors of Minas Tirith, but actually not that many. I like to take a third of my force ranges with spears to form the backline of the army. I'll try to squeeze in as many Fountain Court Guard as I can, because they're just incredibly good profiles, and the rest I'll round out with your simple warriors with a shield, and they'll be like kind of your front rank guy being supported by something that has fight 4 being buffed up to fight 5 by Boromir. I'll always take at least a single Citadel guard on a horse with a longbow for objective contesting. I'll take 2, maybe 3 knights of Minas Tirith spread around in the warbands for some threatening, some charges, and just generally being a nuisance and crashing in there and hopefully killing some stuff. And lastly, there's a siege engine in the list if I have the points for it. Either a bolt thrower or a trebuchet, never really both, and most of the time it's a bolt thrower rather than a trebuchet. Trebuchet is just a little bit too unreliable for my tastes, both in the fact that in some situations you'll just never get to shoot with it, in other situations you get to shoot at a perfect target but you just miss because you need a 4+. And a bolt thrower is a little bit more nimble, you can move it around a little bit more easy, and it can still shoot if your opponent has exposed spears supporting or something like that. So it's a little bit more versatile in that way, but you'll still have situations where it just ends up doing nothing. So it's kind of generally how I approach list building for Minas Tirith, and following that recipe you'll be able to make lists for any points level. You just have to swap out heroes and keep the troop composition more or less the same. Depending on the points levels, I'll take a minor hero like Beregrond with like a micro warband, and you kind of move around or deploy first so that your opponent has to guess where you're going with your main force, things like that. But at the bottom line, it's not really anything special. You have your basic tools to work with, and you want to make sure that every tool is in your army, because that's the strength of Minas Tirith. Now there is another Minas Tirith list that you could build other than the basic list and Legendary Legions, and it deserves a bit of a special mention. It's a favorite of mine, and that's an Earl the Young list. So it's an alliance between Rohan and Minas Tirith, but it's like from a few hundred years ago, from the founding of Rohan. When Earl the Young came to the aid of the steward at the time and helped beat back an invasion of Eastlings and Khand and Orcs, I think, off the top of my head. The Battle of the Celebrant Fields. Now, Earl the Young is incredibly powerful. He's got like this rule that he can get might back when he spends it. He's just really good stats, and he buffs nearby Sons of Earl to 2 attacks, so that they have 3 attacks on charge with strength 5 or even strength 6 piercing strikes. They're absolute beasts. But his penalty is that you can't take any named heroes from Rohan or any allies other than Minas Tirith, but then Minas Tirith can only have unnamed heroes as well. And this is where the King of Men and the Knight of the White Tower will come in. So I always call like the Earl the Young list kind of a Minas Tirith list, because how I play it is that the majority of your points is actually Minas Tirith. You just strip out the named heroes and you replace them with these unnamed heroes that are objectively worse. But you get a incredibly powerful cavalry contingent in return, in Earl the Young and his sons, and they hit like an absolute freight train. I've had opponents' armies just completely break a route because they charged into my anvil, and the hammer that was the Sons of Earl and Earl the Young just smashed into their flank and just wiped the floor of them. It's a personal favorite of mine to run, and I've done decently well with it. It's not the most competitive list out there because you do lose a lot by running, you know, Earl the Young. But it's really fun to play with and to surprise opponents with, and I've got a few third place with it, so not too bad. Just wanted to give that a little special mention. So other than the Earl the Young list, there's some other allies that you can take with Minas Tirith. Like I mentioned when I discussed the army bonus, it's not that special, so you don't actually give up that much by taking yellow allies. Of course, there's green allies in, you know, Rohan and the fiefdoms, or Dead of the Henna, if Ellesar is present. But you can also just take yellow allies, and I think a really good example of it is Gwaihir. Like, Minas Tirith doesn't really have a big beefy monster or some flying or disruption like that, and Gwaihir in a quite efficient package can bring that to your list. The beauty is that although Gwaihir is a hero of legend, if you have Denethor in your Minas Tirith list, his special rule says he has to be a leader, so he still is your leader even though he's a hero of valor, which can be really useful because then Gwaihir can just, you know, go off and do Gwaihir things and rampage and not have to worry about him taking a wound or something and giving up victory points. So that can be a really powerful ally. Another natural fit is fiefdoms, of course, green ally. Imrahil is a beast. Fiefdoms have some really good synergy bonuses with their own troops. But, you know, Imrahil is expensive, so taking him alongside of an expensive Minas Tirith hero like Boromir or Ellesar, you'll run out of points real quick. There is a fun thing that you can do where Imrahil buffs people to fight 5, and then Boromir's banner also works on them, so they go up to fight 6 with, you know, the Swan Knights and things like that. That's really fun. I've seen it used once. It's not that good because you lose out on too many troops, but it is still funny that you can just buff these guys up all the way to fight 6 with when both of them are nearby. Of course, you don't have to run an Earl the Young list if you want to ally Rohan. You can literally pick any Rohan hero and it brings in some Royal Guard. If you want a strong cavalry contingent with bodyguard, that has a little bit more hitting power because they get that extra strength bonus on the charge, and they also have some throwing spears and like that. And of course the fight 4 will make them more reliable in winning fights on the flanks than your Knights of Minas Tirith that are stuck at fight 3. So it's not a bad idea to ally in some Rohan if you really want to go for that hammer and anvil tactic, and you can't guarantee that Boromir is near your Knights of Minas Tirith. So that's also a solid option there. So that's it for allies. So that's all it. It's a bit of a shorter video. It's the heavyweight is all covering all of the units and their pros and cons, because at its core, Minas Tirith is not a complicated list. There's not a whole bunch of niches or tips and tricks or things like that. Nonetheless, I hope you learned something, or at least, you know, found my personal opinions on what units are good or what heroes are good and which ones aren't useful to listen to. If you disagree with anything, please let us know in the comments below. If you agree with something, also let us know. I mean, it helps us and we like the interaction. If you might have noticed in the Eastlings video, we do try to answer every comment or question that gets posted, and it really helps us out. Speaking of which, you might have noticed that there's some nice colorful dice on this table. We have some dice for our channel, and we're doing a giveaway. So if you want to win one of these dice, we'll ship them worldwide. All you have to do is make sure you're subscribed to the channel, like the video, leave a comment with dice in the comment, so that we can search for them, and we'll pick a lucky winner and announce it in the next video. So make sure you do that if you want to get one of these shiny dice. And I do think they turned out quite well. Now, once again, I hope you enjoyed this video. All of this is my opinion as a player. I am not perfect, but I do think that sharing this kind of knowledge can help everyone, and I just really enjoy doing it. So thank you for watching. Maybe see you next time. May your dice not betray you, and this was Lowlands Wargaming.